And talk about South Africa's unemployment statistics coming through today, showing a small improvement, 32.7% in the fourth quarter of 2022. That's versus 32.9% in the prior quarter. To go and give us some insight on that improvement, we've got Siobhan Redford, economist, Rand Merchant Bank, joined in this conversation by Ravi Naidoo, CEO, Youth Employment Service. Siobhan, let me start with you, just in terms of where those numbers stand in terms of your focus. Were you in line? Did you get the number, or were you out?
We don't explicitly forecast unemployment, although I must say it was better than I was expecting, given how I think about how unemployment and GDP are linked. And we aren't expecting a particularly good fourth quarter in terms of GDP, given the high frequency data we have. Interestingly enough, it was the sectors that have been a bit weak, such as your manufacturing and mining, which still saw growth in employment, which is relatively positive.
Now, I wanted to talk about those sectors because I'm seeing here from the numbers that came through, finance, your sector, leading in terms of job creation, 103,000. Then you've got trade, and then you've got transport. I'm leaving out private households for later conversation, but just perhaps give me a sense of whether that makes sense and the sustainability of those jobs, because as one of my colleagues was mentioning in the newsroom, those same sectors that led the advance in terms of job creation in the fourth quarter were the laggards in the third quarter.
Indeed. So, I mean, I think what is interesting is that when you look at it on a kind of more macro level, and I actually did a bit of a comparison relative to kind of before the pandemic, because, that kind of was where the economy was and where we have been recovering to. And we know that GDP, for example, has recovered on aggregate to above its pre-COVID levels. But what is very much worth bearing in mind is that unemployment has not recovered to its pre-COVID levels. So, if we look at the kind of year and quarter before the second quarter of 2020, unemployment was sitting around 29-30%. So I think there's space, given the size of the economy. Although that said, also there's a fair amount of automation that has come in, which is, I think, why we have some level of jobless growth. And definitely, I think there are concerns as to how sustainable it is, given the fact that load shedding has intensified or seems to have intensified even since the fourth quarter of the year of last year. And this, could mean that some businesses are going to have to seriously contemplate, and they have to make trade-offs. And that's the scary part between, do I have to come up with some kind of energy supply solution and spend my money on that, or an additional person? And I think this is going to be a very difficult year in terms of those kinds of trade-offs.
Yeah, and it's the point I was also going to make about jobless growth that you talk about, making Ravi's job even harder, isn't it? Ravi, I want you to come in and perhaps first of all, let's get your thoughts in terms of what you made of those statistics before we talk about these choices and trade-offs that Siobhan is talking about.
Yes, thanks very much, Godfrey. So it is the fourth quarter where there have been positive job numbers, although as you indicated, they're fairly minor in terms of number. But, we should book the win and say that's a good thing. It shows that there's some resilience, and the services economy is still ticking over. But as you say, given the extent of the problem, and as Siobhan has said, the extent of the problem is such that we need much more growth. So if we are getting positive job numbers with this very weak levels of economic growth, just think about how much more we could do if we actually had substantial levels of economic growth. Just given the positioning of the country is actually quite good, if we could just get a few things right.
Yeah. I wanted to note your point about booking the win. Earlier today, New Zealand beat England by 1 run, and that's booked as a win. come on, let's celebrate those wins. So it's 169,000 jobs. We must definitely celebrate it. But I wanted your comment as well on the jobless growth that Siobhan referred to, and how much harder that makes your task, because now your manager is now getting this situation where they have to make a choice between getting that intern in or putting in that machine.
Yes, that's right. So in terms of, so we are working with 1,400 companies across all the sectors, including the ones that we've discussed. And obviously we're doing about 3,000 jobs a month, which are all funded by the private sector. And that's very good because their focus is on quality. It's not a public works program. And the companies that join do it for B incentives and the range of things. But what we find is that because the economic conditions, sort of the ambient conditions, are so difficult, employers have to be very selective about who they bring on. So there's countless times more applicants for the one or two opportunities. So it's going to be the person who's, so they really are very selective, which is so even though we're saying 3,000 a month, I mean, it could easily be much more if there was growth. So we're finding that any ability for the person to work with more technology or show they could, have more aptitude or so on. So it's a very selective environment, and a big part of that is just, as I said, the ambient conditions in the economy.
Ravi, I'm going to come back to you and talk about the industries that you are seeing that are creating jobs and the absorption rate for the young, because we know that an increase in employment is not exactly the same thing as an increase in the employment of youth, even with the program that you are heading. Siobhan, I wanted very quickly to talk about 2023 and the outlook for employment, given the outlook for growth that we are talking about. A question that's especially pertinent when you look at what we were talking about earlier in the markets, where markets are having to rethink about how high US and therefore global interest rates may have to go.
Absolutely. I think this is probably going to be yet another tricky year. It's going to be tricky in a different way as well, which also doesn't help. We've come to terms with the impact of the pandemic, that we had the supply chain shortages, that we've come back from that we've had the different waves. Now we've got China coming back online. But at the same time, there's very high inflation globally, as you mentioned, historically very high, interest rates rising, but very likely to still go higher in a number of our major kind of trading partners, particularly developed markets. So it really is going to be about a balance between how slow those countries go in response to higher interest rates. Right now, the evidence is still fairly strong, but I think we're also quite early in that response cycle. There is a lag between kind of the increase in interest rates and the kind of outcome on economic activity, but then also what happens with China and their demand for commodities. So it's an incredibly uncertain environment. Probably means that you could probably see some slowdown in employment for permanent employees. I would suggest that if you're uncertain, you're not going to try and put extra permanent people on your books, but rather where you have a need, take on, part-time employees or contractors to fulfill immediate needs.
And you made an interesting comment there, and I wanted to know, to point to it, where you say it could be a tricky year. There's no question about it, given all the factors that you are mentioning. I wanted to talk, though, about something that I would want to see as a silver lining, if you like. I'm looking for positives here. The financial sector, creating 103,000 jobs, the most of all the major sectors. But what I didn't hear is the manufacturing sector, which we know, of course, has got a higher multiplier effects.
The problem within the manufacturing sector is that they are being hit very hard by this high level of load shedding. And so, we've seen that in terms of food manufacturing, how it's affecting costs, but also is leading to spoiled foodstuffs. And so I think we probably are going to see a slow pickup, if any pickup, in the manufacturing sector. Some areas might have some kind of backup, but that's causing them extra costs, which hopefully government is going to help ease a bit, given the tax relief, particularly for manufacturing of food. However, it's broader than that. And then it's also, ports, and it's about firstly bringing in the kind of parts we need for the manufacturing process, which are also probably being affected by unfortunately Transnet.
Yeah.
Our ports, as well as the movement of the parts, and then trying to get them out again. So the manufacturing sector, unfortunately, is really at the crux next to the mining sector, really been hit hard by our structural constraints.
Yeah, Siobhan, we've put in a request for an interview with the President of South Africa. Let's hope he will honor that request. And if he does come along, I'm going to ask you for your key question, but certainly what around manufacturing would suffice. That's Siobhan. Let me get your final thoughts, Ravi, in terms of the absorption rates that you are seeing within the employers that you guys are working with.
Yeah, so we're finding very good absorption rates, because once someone has come into a program, you want to hold on to the people who are doing well, right? Because it's very expensive to lose good people.
Yeah.
So we're finding that for those who are lucky enough to get in, the absorption rates can be over 50%, and particularly where you get into things like ICT services, which are obviously growing, financial services, things which have a degree of technology linked to them. So we're finding that retailers are taking people in, but people who can work in last mile delivery, but using apps, things where. So I think those tend to do well. Where we have challenges are where companies are very closely impacted by state infrastructure services. Like you're trying to export, you depend on a lot of electricity.
Sure.
Those things tend to have the most difficulty.
Very quick question. What about the retention rates? What are you seeing?
Sorry, when you mean retention rates, you mean retention of what?
Like the kids that you are able to get into this program, are they being retained by the companies where they are working at?
So it differs a lot, but I think it can go from 100% down to 2%. So I think we find generally it's about 40 to 50%. And I think these would be where the caliber of the people are and the type of thing they've now gained in this year of experience really is going to make them a valuable at the company. And I think we find, depending on the selection of the youth, a lot of them are at the end much more able to get into the entrepreneurial space, micro enterprises and so on, which is an area that South Africa needs to be much kinder to, because that's going to be where 90% of the future jobs will be absorbed.
No question. Ravi, thanks very much. And of course, here at CNBC Africa as well, we're doing our own little bit. I've got a couple of interns in the background who are working very hard indeed and trying to make a difference here. Their contribution is well valued. Ravi, thank you. Ravi Naidoo, CEO, Youth Employment Services. Siobhan Redford, economist, Rand Merchant Bank, rounding up our conversation on those unemployment stats that came through today. A slight improvement it is, but we're still talking about 7.8 million people without jobs, a damning number. There's no question about it. That's our update on a Power Lunch Southern.